You think addiction is about drugs, about needles and bottles, but what if I told you it's not? When most people hear the word addiction, they imagine the tragic images of substance abuse. Needles in arms, empty bottles, broken homes. But that view is too narrow. Addiction isn't just a chemical dependency, it's a symptom. A signal flare from the deepest part of us, trying to say something we've forgotten how to hear. Carl Jung, one of the great minds of modern psychology, once said, "Every form of addiction is a substitute for genuine spiritual connection." This might sound poetic, even abstract, but it's anything but. Jung wasn't talking about religion in a dogmatic sense. He was pointing to something more universal, a fundamental human need for meaning, for wholeness, for connection to something greater than ourselves. This isn't a video about substances. It's about the human soul and what happens when it gets lost. Behind every addictive behavior lies a story, not of weakness, but of pain, not of moral failure, but of longing. Addiction, in its many forms, is often a desperate attempt to fill a void we don't know how to name. A void that might stem from trauma, isolation, or the quiet erosion of meaning in modern life. In this exploration, we'll move beyond the surface of addiction and ask deeper questions. What are we really craving? What is the soul trying to say when it reaches for escape? And how can we begin to truly heal? Not just the symptoms, but the source. Let's begin. The myth of addiction. Culturally, we've been conditioned to see addiction as a moral failing, a consequence of bad choices, weak willpower, or flawed character. This stigma is deeply embedded in how society judges those struggling with addiction. The dominant narrative blames the individual. If only they had more discipline, or they chose this path. The result is shame, isolation, and a failure to address the deeper roots of suffering. In contrast, the scientific view reframes addiction as a disease, a chemical imbalance, a dysfunction in the brain's dopamine system. Research shows that addiction hijacks the brain's reward circuitry, rewiring it to compulsively seek short-term relief or pleasure, often at the expense of long-term well-being. This model offers a more compassionate frame. Addiction is not a choice, but a neurological trap. Yet even this lens can fall short. It tends to pathologize addiction as a brokenness to be fixed, rather than a symptom to be understood. Carl Jung challenged both perspectives. In a letter to Alcoholics Anonymous co-founder Bill Wilson, Jung wrote, "Addiction isn't a malfunction of the brain. It's a message from the soul." This radical statement reframes addiction not as a defect, but as a signal, a spiritual cry for connection, wholeness, and purpose. Jung saw addiction as a misguided search for transcendence, a hunger for something more than what life, in its everyday form, seems to offer. From this vantage point, addiction is not fundamentally about substances. It's about meaning. What the addict truly seeks isn't alcohol, opioids, or gambling, but a sense of aliveness, belonging, and depth. Substance use becomes a stand-in for unmet spiritual or existential needs. In this light, recovery is not simply about abstaining from harmful behavior, but about discovering a richer, more meaningful life. The soul doesn't want to escape life. It wants to be fully alive within it. Addiction, then, may be less of a disease and more of a misunderstood longing. The spiritual void. The spiritual void is a profound inner emptiness, an aching sense of disconnection from purpose, authenticity, and the deeper self. It is not merely a lack of belief or religion, but a psychological and existential absence of meaning. This void arises when individuals lose touch with what truly animates their lives, leading to a sense of fragmentation and alienation from their own inner world. In the modern world, the spiritual void manifests in subtle yet pervasive ways. Overworking, doom-scrolling through endless bad news, and the compulsive need for external validation are all symptoms of a deeper dis-ease. These behaviors provide distraction, but not nourishment, stimulation, but not fulfillment. Social media likes, productivity metrics, and 24/7 news cycles offer the illusion of connection and importance, yet often deepen the inner sense of hollowness. Psychologically, the spiritual void reflects the soul's desperate attempt to escape suffering without addressing its root. As one insightfully put it, when the soul loses its connection to meaning, it reaches for anything that numbs the ache. Whether through addiction, constant busyness, or digital escape, the pain of spiritual emptiness is often masked rather than healed. Carl Jung explored this phenomenon through the concept of the God archetype. For Jung, this archetype represents not a literal deity, but the deep, organizing principle of the self, the innermost center of human wholeness. When this archetype is denied or repressed, individuals lose access to a source of inner guidance and coherence. The result is not just spiritual confusion, but psychological fragmentation. Jung warned that in the absence of this inner center, people will project their yearning for meaning onto false idols, whether ideologies, celebrities, or material success. To confront the spiritual void is not to fill it with noise or distraction, but to turn inward, to rediscover the self as a source of depth and meaning. Only then can one begin to heal the inner fracture and restore a sense of authentic purpose. Modern addiction and dopamine culture. In today's hyper-connected world, addiction often hides in plain sight. Unlike traditional vices, modern addictions, social media, smartphones, endless streams of content, are clean, convenient, and socially accepted. These behaviors don't carry the same stigma as drug or alcohol abuse, yet they operate on a similar neurological level. Each notification, like, or scroll delivers a tiny dopamine hit, creating a feedback loop of instant gratification. Over time, the brain develops tolerance, demanding more frequent or intense stimuli to achieve the same fleeting sense of pleasure. This mirrors classic addiction patterns: tolerance, withdrawal, compulsion, and ultimately, shame. A person who once found joy in a single message now checks their phone 100 times a day, not out of interest, but out of compulsion. There's an emptiness after each check, a subtle disappointment that the fix wasn't enough. One man, for example, starts his day by reaching for his phone before he even sits up in bed. By noon, he's tapped through dozens of notifications, skimmed countless videos, and responded to messages he barely read. By nightfall, he feels hollow. The content isn't nourishing, it's anesthetizing. He's not addicted to the media itself. He's terrified of being alone with his own thoughts. This is the essence of the modern numbing epidemic. Instead of confronting discomfort, boredom, loneliness, fear, we soothe it with a digital distraction. But rather than resolving the root issue, this constant self-medication suppresses the signals our minds and bodies are trying to send. We scroll not because we care, but because stillness feels unbearable. The irony is that the more we reach for these tools to feel better, the worse we often end up feeling. In a dopamine-driven culture, the true addiction may not be to the phone, but to the escape it provides from ourselves. Addiction as a symbol. Carl Jung's approach to addiction offers a strikingly different lens than conventional medical or psychological models. Rather than seeing addiction purely as a biochemical malfunction or moral failure, Jung viewed it as a symbol, a manifestation of a deeper spiritual or existential crisis. In a letter to Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, Jung famously described the alcoholic's craving as the equivalent, on a low level, of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness. In other words, addiction is not the problem itself, but the symptom of a more profound longing. At its core, addiction can be seen as a misdirected spiritual quest. The ritualistic patterns of use, the preparation, the consumption, the secrecy, suggest that the addict is engaged in something deeper than simple pleasure-seeking. These rituals mimic those of spiritual traditions, but they are corrupted echoes. The addict isn't chasing a high, as one modern interpretation puts it. They're chasing wholeness through the wrong door. Substances become a false sacrament, promising transcendence, but delivering disintegration. Jung's symbolic interpretation casts addiction as the psyche's desperate attempt to fill a void. The substance, or behavior, is a placeholder for meaning, purpose, or connection. The addict is trying to commune with something greater, but in the absence of a healthier channel. Art, nature, love, faith, they turn to substances as a substitute for transcendence. This process can also be visualized through the metaphor of the mask. Addiction is the mask the wound wears. It covers the trauma, the loneliness, the shame, offering temporary relief while simultaneously preventing true healing. The mask may look different for each person: alcohol, drugs, gambling, work, but its function is the same: to shield the self from pain, even as it compounds it. Ultimately, Jung invites us to look beyond the behavior to the deeper cry underneath, to see addiction not as the disease, but as the symbol of the soul's hunger. The shadow self, Carl Jung's concept of the shadow, refers to the unconscious part of the psyche that houses the traits, desires, and memories we repress or deny, usually because they are deemed unacceptable by society or by our own standards. It is the dark side of the self, not inherently evil, but often feared, misunderstood, and ignored. Yet, ignoring the shadow does not make it disappear. Instead, it festers and influences our behavior in ways we don't fully understand, often manifesting through projection, self-sabotage, or addiction. Addiction, in many cases, is not simply about a substance or behavior. It is a symptom of a deeper psychological wound. The source is often buried trauma or unmet emotional needs that remain unacknowledged in the shadow. These unresolved experiences take root in the unconscious, feeding a quiet despair or emptiness that demands relief. Drugs, alcohol, compulsive sex, or workaholism offer temporary anesthesia, a way to escape the pain that consciousness refuses to face. Consider the example of a man who drinks, not to celebrate, but to silence a voice that's haunted him since childhood. It whispers, "You'll always be alone. You're not enough." These words, perhaps spoken once in anger or neglect, became embedded in his identity, repressed but never resolved. His shadow holds that voice, and his addiction becomes a coping mechanism, a barrier between his conscious self and the unbearable weight of unworthiness. The tragedy is that addiction works until it doesn't. For a time, the substance shields him from the shadow's truth, but eventually, the drink stops numbing. The voice grows louder. Relationships fray. The body breaks down. The shadow demands recognition. Only by turning inward, by confronting the repressed parts of himself, can he begin to heal. Facing the shadow is painful, but it is also the beginning of integration, of becoming whole. The dragon and the gold addiction is like a dragon, fierce, consuming, and seemingly impossible to defeat. It guards a hidden treasure deep within, your truest self. The dragon is terrifying, yes, but it is also symbolic. It represents pain, fear, shame, and unmet needs, forces that once protected you, even as they now imprison you. We often think recovery means slaying the dragon, kill the addiction, bury the past, move on. But in myth, dragons guard treasure for a reason. The gold, your love, purpose, healing, and spiritual truth, cannot be claimed without confronting the guardian. And not with violence, but with understanding. This is the reframing. The dragon isn't your enemy. It's a part of you that learned to breathe fire to survive. It demands your attention because the gold it protects is too valuable to ignore. Each craving, relapse, or moment of despair is the dragon's roar, calling you inward, not to destroy you, but to lead you toward what you've forgotten, your worth, your wholeness. Healing doesn't come from battle. It comes from bravery, the kind that faces the dragon with compassion. You begin to see the dragon not as a monster, but as a wounded protector. And as you sit with it, listen to it, and learn from it, something shifts. The flames lose their power. The treasure comes into view. Recovery is not about exile from your past, but reunion with your soul. The gold was never gone. It was always waiting, buried beneath the fire, guarded by a part of you that simply wanted to be seen. True recovery. Jung's solution isn't merely sobriety, it's integration. He understood that addiction isn't just a chemical dependency, but a psychological cry for wholeness. Recovery, in this deeper sense, doesn't stop at abstaining from the substance. It asks a harder question. What was the substance trying to numb, distract, or silence? Addiction is often a coping strategy, a way to avoid the parts of the self that feel unbearable. True recovery is a shift from avoidance to awareness. It's not about asserting control over the behavior alone. It's about confronting the wound underneath it. This is where shadow work begins, the intentional act of meeting the parts of ourselves we've disowned. The anger, the fear, the shame, the grief. These are the fragments pushed into the unconscious, and they don't disappear. They fester, manifesting as compulsions, depression, or self-destruction. Integration means allowing those parts back into conscious life, not to indulge them, but to understand and reintegrate them. When the shadow is acknowledged, it loses its destructive power. Jung believed that wholeness comes not from perfection, but from embracing our full humanity, light and dark alike. In this light, healing becomes less about trimming symptoms and more about healing the root. It's not just, don't drink. It's, why did you need to? And beyond that, what do you need now, truly, to feel whole? Recovery, then, is not the end of something. It's the beginning of becoming fully human. Spiritual healing in a modern world. Our modern culture promotes distraction, not reflection. In a world driven by constant connectivity and productivity, we are rarely encouraged to pause, breathe, or look inward. Sacred practices that once grounded us, prayer, meditation, time in nature, storytelling, have been displaced by endless scrolling, competitive hustle, and material consumption. The soul's needs are often drowned in noise. This shift hasn't made us freer, it's made us more fractured. Many forms of addiction, substance use, social media, workaholism, aren't merely personal failings, but symptoms of a deeper cultural wound. They are cries for meaning, for belonging, for something real. We are hungry for wholeness in a system that profits from our fragmentation. Spiritual healing begins when we remember what's been forgotten, that we are not machines, but sacred beings, that stillness has value, that the inner life matters. Healing does not mean escaping the modern world, but rerouting within it, creating space for reflection, ritual, and connection. To heal spiritually in today's world is an act of resistance. It is choosing to tune in rather than tune out. It's choosing to reconnect with ourselves, with others, with something greater. In this remembering, we begin to restore what has been lost. Last message: addiction is not about substances, it's about the soul. Beneath the cravings and compulsions lies a deeper hunger, a longing for wholeness, for purpose, for the self. Carl Jung understood this. He saw that the addict isn't just chasing a high, they're chasing meaning. Addiction, he wrote, is a search for God. It's a misguided attempt to fill a spiritual void, to reconnect with something lost, something sacred. Recovery, then, is not just about quitting. It's about remembering. It's about turning inward to face the pain, the emptiness, and the forgotten parts of ourselves. True healing begins when we recognize that what we've been searching for was never out there. It's been within us all along. The opposite of addiction isn't just sobriety. It's connection to yourself, your pain, your truth, and to the sacred thread that never stopped calling your name. When you begin to listen, to answer that call, the journey transforms. You are not broken. You are becoming.